Okay. So have you ever found yourself just, really getting into like arranging your books or organizing your desk or like just
Yeah.
so when someone walks by and is like, "Oh my God, you are so OCD."
Right.
It's like it's almost become this weird shorthand for just being organized,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that a lot, actually.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
It really minimizes a real, often really challenging anxiety disorder.
Right.
And it really muddies the waters when we're actually trying to understand the difference between OCD and perfectionism.
Totally.
So in this deep dive, we're going way beyond those surface level assumptions.
Okay.
We're going to untangle those two often confused concepts so you can walk away with a clearer understanding of what they really are and what they are most definitely not. And to help us with this deep dive, I'd like to welcome our expert.
Happy to be here.
It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's
Yeah.
definitely something worth digging into a little bit
It,
deeper.
it really is.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
When we talk about OCD,
Hmm.
what's like the one crucial distinction that we need to make right off the bat?
Yeah, you're right. It's super important to move beyond that image most people have of like the person who likes things neat and tidy.
Right.
OCD is really characterized by these intrusive, unwanted thoughts.
Mm.
Those are what we call obsessions. And then these obsessions lead to significant anxiety,
Okay.
which then lead to these rituals, these compulsions that the person feels like they have to perform to alleviate that anxiety.
So it's not even just preferring a clean kitchen.
Right.
It's more like,
Exactly.
yeah.
It's a really good example from the stuff that you shared. It's like the fear of contamination.
Right.
It's not someone who just likes to wipe down their counters.
Oh.
They might spend hours each day washing their hands because they're so terrified of germs, even if they logically know that they're going above and beyond what's really reasonable.
Wow. That really brings home the difference, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Like that anxiety driving the actions,
right.
that's a whole other dimension.
Huge difference.
So how about perfectionism then?
Okay.
Is it always tied to anxiety in the same way, or is it something totally different?
That is a great question, and it's really at the heart of it all.
Yeah.
So while anxiety is definitely a component of perfectionism, it's not always the driving force the way that it is with OCD.
Okay.
Perfectionism is really more than just having high standards.
It's often fueled by a fear of failure.
Right.
This constant, sometimes really harsh self-criticism if things just aren't, quote, perfect,
Oh, yeah.
according to their own definition.
And that's something a lot of people can probably relate to, at least a little bit, right?
Totally.
I've definitely caught myself like putting off a project
Oh, absolutely.
just because I was worried it wasn't going to be good enough in the end.
Yeah, and you've hit on something that comes up all the time in everyday life.
Mm.
One of the research studies that you sent even mentioned a study where self-identified perfectionists actually performed worse under pressure
Oh, wow.
because of that fear of not measuring up.
Oh, interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It's like the fear is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wow.
Isn't that fascinating? So it's like we've got these two things that are like kind of similar,
Huh.
but also different,
Right.
and they get used interchangeably even though they're driven by these different things.
Mm.
You know?
Totally.
It's almost like one of those optical illusions
Okay, yeah.
where you can look at it one way and see one thing,
Mm-hmm.
and then look at it another way, and it's like a totally different image.
Right.
How do we even start to like tease those motivations apart?
Yeah.
Like what's the difference between what's going on under the surface?
You're really getting at something super important.
Yeah.
It's about going beyond just the surface
Okay.
because, it might look the same from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Someone with a super organized desk or like a color-coded calendar.
Right.
But the why behind it
Mm-hmm.
is completely different, like
Got
with OCD. The compulsion, the ritual, it's all about anxiety reduction.
Okay.
It's about trying to like prevent this dreaded outcome,
Right.
even if that outcome seems totally irrational to
Mm.
someone on the outside.
But
With perfectionism, it's more about a need for control, a desire to control outcomes, to meet all those,
yeah.
really demanding internal standards.
So it's not even about the what, it's about the why.
Exactly.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah, and this is sometimes where it clicks for people.
Yeah.
They're like, oh my gosh, you can't judge a book by its cover.
Yeah.
Or in this case, you can't just look at someone's behavior
Right.
and know what's going on. Someone could be at their desk organizing everything.
Yeah.
And it could be because they're trying to deal with the anxiety of contamination, which would be more OCD. Or they could be doing the exact same thing.
Right.
But for them, it's about feeling in control and meeting their need for things to be perfect.
Right.
And that's more like perfectionism.
Okay.
So it's not about the action. It's about, like you said, what's going on internally.
Which makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But I think it gets really tricky when we start talking about overlap.
Okay.
Because these are like two different things,
Right.
but they're not like mutually exclusive, are they?
Exactly.
Can you be like a perfectionist and have OCD?
Yes, that's such a good point.
No.
You know, because we like to categorize things.
Yeah.
But when it comes to people's experiences, it's just not that simple.
Right.
We've been talking about these two different categories, but it's really more like a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, for sure, someone can absolutely be dealing with both.
So then how do we navigate that?
Yeah.
How can someone figure out if they're dealing with one or the other or both?
That's where self-awareness and talking to a professional is so important.
Okay.
It's important to remember that just because you might like to do things in a certain way, like you like things, just so,
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily mean that
Yeah.
you have OCD.
Yeah.
However,
Yeah.
if you have that really strong urge for order,
Yeah.
like some perfectionists have,
Okay.
that can sometimes become more like OCD
Right.
when it starts to cause a lot of distress.
Okay.
And you feel like you have to do certain things to manage that stress.
Did you give us an example of like what that would actually look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say someone likes to organize their bookshelves by color.
Okay.
You know, most people would look at that and think, oh, that's organized.
Yeah.
But let's say this person,
Yeah.
they can't relax
Mm-hmm.
unless every single book is in its exact spot.
Oh, wow.
Like they might rearrange their whole bookshelf multiple times a day
Oh, no.
because they're having all these intrusive thoughts
Right.
about things being wrong or contaminated, but they're
Yeah.
not perfectly lined up.
Oh, wow.
So that constant tension and needing to do things over and over
Yeah.
to feel okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's when it might be something more than just liking things a certain way.
Yeah.
And it might be really important to talk to a professional.
Yeah, it's like that could be really tough to deal with.
It really can.
And it really makes you realize that like getting professional help is so important
Absolutely.
if you're dealing with these kinds of thoughts and behaviors.
I couldn't agree more. And, you know, speaking of help,
Yeah.
the stuff that you shared mentioned therapy,
Right.
especially like CBT and ERP for OCD.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't really get into like the details of treatment.
Yeah, you're right. It was mostly about figuring out the difference between the two.
Right.
So for someone listening who's like, okay, this is all great,
Yeah.
but like, where do I go from here?
Right.
How can therapy help with like developing coping mechanisms and stuff?
Well, it's a really good question because knowing the difference between these things, like we've been talking about,
Right.
that's like the first step.
Okay.
But it's definitely not the whole thing.
Right.
And that's really where a therapist can come in because they can offer that guidance and support
Mm-hmm.
that you just can't get from reading something on your own.
Okay.
And whether it's OCD or perfectionism or a bit of both,
Right.
a good therapist will help you figure out those thought patterns
Mm-hmm.
and then you can start to work on them.
So what does that look like? It's like,
Well-
how do you challenge a thought?
It's different for everybody.
Okay.
And it depends on what kind of therapy you're doing, but generally it's about helping you recognize those negative thought patterns
Right.
and reframe them, you know,
Yeah.
like with perfectionism.
Oh.
Your therapist might help you set like more realistic expectations.
Okay.
So you're not always striving for this impossible standard of perfect.
Right.
And for someone with OCD, therapy might involve like slowly exposing you to the things you're afraid of,
Okay.
but in a really safe and controlled way.
All right.
That's the idea behind exposure therapy, is like you're kind of rewiring your brain
Oh, wow.
so you're not stuck in that same loop of anxiety.
So it's not even about like getting rid of those thoughts entirely.
Right.
It's more about like learning how to manage them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're building up a toolbox
Yeah.
full of ways to cope with the anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
You learn how to deal with those feelings
Right.
without letting them control your life.
Wow.
It's definitely a process, and
Yeah.
it can be really hard sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But the important thing is you don't have to go through it alone.
That's so important. And it's a good reminder of why we're doing this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just a bunch of random information, right?
Definitely not.
Like whether you're going through something yourself
Right.
or you're trying to understand someone you love,
Mhm.
it's about so much more than that.
Absolutely.
Knowing the difference between OCD and perfectionism,
Yeah,
it helps you understand yourself and other people so much better.
for sure.
And you can respond with way more empathy and support.
100%.
And that kind of brings us full circle.
It does.
We've covered a ton in this deep dive.
Yeah, we really did.
But if there's just one thing you remember,
Yeah.
It's that OCD and perfectionism, they're two very distinct things
Right.
with their own unique challenges.
Totally.
But when you know the why behind what someone's doing,
Yes.
those motivations,
Yeah.
it's like you're not just learning something new. You're actually gaining this power
Yeah.
to understand yourself and everyone around you in a deeper way
So true.
and to be more understanding and supportive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive.
This was great.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
We really went deep on the nuances of OCD and perfectionism today.
We did.
And remember, knowledge is power.
Yes, it is.
So until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep into all the things that make us human.
I love that.